Then we come to clause 40, Amendment 133A in the name of Lord Wigley.
My Lords, my name is to Amendment 133A as well. Amendment 133A is a probing amendment, and it states that the Secretary of State will be acting on behalf of the United Kingdom government when they establish the body to administer the compensation scheme for victims of the infected blood scandal. Amendment 133B, this amendment stipulates that payments made under clause 40 must be fully funded by the Treasury, and in anticipation of the noble Lady Baroness Brinton, on Amendment 134, this amendment is intended to probe how and when compensation payments will be made to victims of the infected blood scandal. I should just acknowledge the letter which the noble Lord Earl Howe sent to us, and the meetings we've had, which were very constructive, that there may be future amendments coming forward at report stage. But for now, I beg to move Amendment 133A.
Amendment clause 40, page 37, line 15, after must, insert on behalf of the United Kingdom government.
To start by recognising that one of the people who had wanted to speak this afternoon to this amendment is not in his place. Lord Cormac told me that he was going to speak, and his death over the weekend leaves a large gap, not just in Parliament, but with the victims and their families of the infected blood scandal who he supported. He said in the Commons on the 13th of November 1989, "No one can give back to these victims the hope of a normal life that was once theirs. No one can remove the uncertainty with which they and their families live from day to day, the uncertainty of when the bell will toll. If any group of people live in the shadow of death, they do. It is no wonder that their story has been described as the most tragic in the history of the NHS. I hope that we shall have a good and full answer from the Minister, but whatever he says, unless he agrees to our request, the campaign will go on and we shall not go away." Patrick, we shall go on. May you rest in peace. I want to thank Earl Howe for the meeting that we had, and indeed his letter, to discuss this amendment, as well as clause 40, and I hope that he will have better news for your Lordship's house today. And it's a pleasure to follow Lord Ponsonby on Lord Wigley's two amendments, 133A and B, which talk about the payments for the blood scheme, infected blood scheme being arranged on behalf of the UK government and paid from UK Treasury. It's right. This scandal has been going on now for approaching 50 years, long before devolution, and therefore it's inappropriate for Scotland and Wales to have to foot the bill for something that is clearly the responsibility of the UK government. Clause 40 of the bill was an amendment laid by Dame Diana Johnson MP in the Commons and won cross-party support in a vote. It requires the government to establish a body to administer the compensation scheme for victims of the infected blood scandal. The clause is the original wording of the Infected Blood Inquiry's second interim report, Recommendation 13, and also incorporates Recommendations 3 and 4. My probing amendment, 134, was also laid in the Commons, but unfortunately there was no time to debate it. It would ensure that an interim compensation payment of £100,000 is made in respect of deaths not yet recognised, specifically ensuring that where an infected victim died either as a child or as an adult without a partner or child, their bereaved parents would receive the compensation payment. And where an infected victim has died and there is no bereaved partner, but there is a bereaved child or children, including adopted children, the compensation should be paid to bereaved child or children split equally. And where an infected victim has died and there is no bereaved partner, child or parent, but there is a bereaved sibling or siblings, they should receive the compensation payment. It should be noted that the wording is the original wording of the Infected Blood Inquiry's second interim report, Recommendation 12. And it's also very helpful, my lords, that both the Welsh and the Scottish governments have written to the UK government to support the compensation in advance of the inquiry reporting in May. On the 18th of December last year, the Paymaster General, John Glenn, made a statement raising expectations expectations, but unfortunately provided no information on when a compensation body would be established, let alone when interim payments in respect of unrecognised deaths might be made. Both Clause 40 and this amendment are only the latest attempts to move government, not just this government, but many, many governments of differing political parties, into sorting out and paying the compensation that is due to these groups of people whose lives over the last 4 decades have been severely affected or destroyed by acts of the NHS, and therefore also by the government, which used infected blood to treat haemophiliac patients through Factor VIII, as well as for those receiving whole blood transfusions. The numbers are grim. Just under 5,000 people with haemophilia and other bleeding disorders were infected with HIV and hepatitis through the use of contaminated clotting factors. Some unknowingly infected their partners. Since then, 3,000 have died. Of the 1,243 infected with HIV, fewer than 250 are still alive. And many thousands who had full blood transfusions in the 80s and 90s were infected with hepatitis. My lords, some people may not even know that they were infected as a result of a transfusion. And I want to thank all the victims and family members who've written to me. I cannot do them and all the different campaigning groups justice in the short time today. But my lords, they have been victimised again, time and again, by the NHS and by governments fighting them and all other victims over the years. I'm afraid sometimes with lies and prevarication. I want to pay particular tribute to 2 indomitable women who are still campaigning after 30 plus years. Colette Wintle and Carol Grayson were part of a small group that in 2007 sued 4 pharma companies, Bayer, Baxter, Alpha and Armour in the US, who had used contaminated blood from prisoners to make Factor VIII, which the NHS bought and used without any warning to patients and their families. The American judge acknowledged that the pharma companies had used infected blood, but he disallowed the case on a technicality because he said that the duty of care for patients in the UK lay with the NHS and therefore the UK government. But my lords, the government did nothing. In an independent and privately funded Archer inquiry, which reported in 2009, was followed by Theresa May setting up the full public inquiry chaired by Sir Brian Langstaff, who has now issued 2 interim reports, with the final report now due in May of this year. And in the middle of all of that, Sir Robert Francis also completed a report on the structure of compensation, which was published in March 2022, with which Sir Brian agrees, and he has built into the recommendations in his second interim report. That report, published last year, is an extraordinary read. No minister or official can ignore the clear language and recommendations evidenced by witnesses to the inquiry that showed decades of government and NHS willfully ignoring their responsibilities and lying to victims and their families. My lords, the government has also recently announced that Sir Jonathan Montgomery, as the chair of the group of clinical, legal and social experts, will give the government technical advice on compensation. Unfortunately, my lords, this has not helped their relationship with the victims. Firstly, there is concern that this group will also slow down the process of compensation. And secondly, the chair, Sir Jonathan Montgomery, a well-respected ethicist, has links with Bayer, one of the 4 pharma companies who sold infected blood to the NHS. And disappointingly, my lords, ministers have said recently in oral questions that they won't start until the government has considered Sir Brian's final report. We know, my lords, it usually takes at least 6 months for the government to formally respond to an inquiry report when it's published. So can the minister tell us whether it will now change this and move swiftly to make the compensation happen as Sir Brian recommends? My lords, I want to end with the voice of these victims, because it's too easy to talk about the history of the scandal without understanding the reality of their lives. Sir Brian's inquiry heard Jason Evans' experience. He was 4 when his father died from HIV. It just marked every aspect of life. And you know, I've now lived my dad's entire lifespan and I'm sat here, so it's blanketed my entire existence. And when asked whether he'd ever been offered counselling or psychological support, no, never. And I think the thing that is particularly despicable to me is, okay, now I'm 31, but as a child of 4, 5, 6-year-old, how did I not have bereavement counselling? How was it never offered? Lauren Palmer emailed me. She said, growing up, I was the little sister to 2 older half-brothers in what seemed like a relatively normal family. Unknown to us, my father was co-infected with HIV and hepatitis C via his factor VIII. But my father had also regrettably infected my mother. In 1993, when I was just 9 years old, both my mother and my father passed away from their infections within 8 days of each other. I was heartbreakingly separated from my brothers, and my life, my family were completely torn apart. It emotionally destroys me on a daily basis that both my parents' lives have not yet been recognised when others rightly have. The children and parents of victims are having to fight tirelessly for decades to be discarded with countless empty promises of responses from the government which have no cause for action. It is degrading and greatly disrespectful. My Lords Colette Wintle and Carol Grayson also had to face years of illness and the deaths of their husbands. One reported that they were not told when one of the family victims had died. His mother was not permitted by the hospital to stroke his head. Years later, they found out this because his brain and body parts had been removed without seeking permission from the family. His brain was finally buried with his brother, also infected, when he too died as a result of receiving factor VIII. And Colette and Carol, along with thousands of other victims, have been lied to, pushed away, denied justice by officials. This too is now coming out in the inquiry. No wonder that Sir Brian is urging the government to ensure that they start right now with expanding the scheme to include the affected persons, implementing interim payments, and moving as fast as possible to a full settlement. Lord Waldegrave had hoped to be able to speak today. Like Lord Cormac, he had acted on this in the Commons, and I know he's told the Minister that the government must follow Sir Brian to the letter or face immense disappointment and dismay. My Lord, this government says it's doing everything at pace for the Post Office Horizon scheme, with most settlements in full by August or as soon as possible thereafter. The victims of the infected blood scandal deserve no less.
My Lords, I rise to speak to these 3 amendments, and my apologies for not having been in the chamber during the second reading. Thousands of people have died because of government and officials' lies and obfuscation about the contaminated blood scandal. And the government, and in fact every government for the last 40 years, should be ashamed. Perhaps this government more than all, because when we finally got the long campaign for and long literally begged for public inquiry, and praise to Theresa May for initiating that inquiry, the chair of that inquiry, Sir Brian, has said in terms what the compensation should be and that it should be paid and paid swiftly. And unbelievably, the government is still prevaricating. I hope it is not hoping to limp on to the next election. We need to do better to stop obfuscation and delay, to make the amends that can be made, although nothing will ever make up for what's happened. I have to say that that Baroness Brinton's speech was extraordinary and laid it out far better than I can do, because we can never bring back the 3,000 who have died and are dying every day, every single day while this is delayed, nor the suffering experienced by this 40-year agonizing wait for justice. And I have to declare an interest because my nephew, Nicholas Hirsch, one of my sister's twin boys who was a haemophiliac and contracted hepatitis C, died aged 35, leaving a 10-month-old baby daughter. And every family that has lost a loved one is in the same position. And those who are still living need to live to see justice. And the families of those who have died need to see justice. But the time being taken is obscene and inordinate and cruel. And the rubbish, I'm afraid, being pumped out by the government about waiting for the final bit of the inquiry is intolerable. Sir Brian, brilliant chair of the inquiry, has made it crystal clear that there is no need and no time to wait. And quite frankly, we shouldn't need a TV series and public outrage to be the motivation for the government to do the right thing. I've been trying over the years myself to get redress on the issue. I remember going with Lynn Kelly, who was head of Welsh haemophilia, to meet with Chris Wormald, the then permanent secretary of the Department of Health, to show him the proof of obfuscation and lies. And he lied to us there and then he lied in writing, a lie for which he later apologised in writing, and which I submitted in evidence to the inquiry. It was shameful how many lies were told by officials to parents, to victims and families of those who were contaminated. And the very least the government can do now is to act, right now, before any more victims die. And before I sit down, I just want to pay tribute to all the campaigners and fighters and families who have sought justice. I'd particularly like to thank the Labour MP, Dame Diana Johnson, who has been chair of the APG and fought so hard on this, and to Jason Evans from the campaign of Factor 8. It is important that it is clear beyond doubt and lays the responsibility where it lies at the government's door in terms of these amendments, that it is the government that is responsible for fully funding payments, that the government sets up the body that will administrate this on behalf of the government, and that it puts on record how and when this will happen. And please stop prevaricating that it needs to wait for the final report. Please, for decency and for honour and for compassion, do the right thing and do it now.
I'm just following Baroness Featherstone. To give my strongest possible support.
Would the Baroness give way? So Baroness Campbell, I believe, wishes to contribute.
My Lords, before I begin, I'd also like to pay tribute to the late Lord Cormac. He was a consummate parliamentarian. He was a consummate parliamentarian, but he was also my friend and taught me so much when I arrived in the House. And equally, he gave terrific support to disability issues on every occasion and was very supportive. My Lords, I speak in support of this Amendment 134 in the name of the noble lady, Baroness Brinton. I declare an interest because my first husband, Graham, had haemophilia and received infected blood products. As a result, he contracted both hepatitis C and HIV. We only learned of this after we had become engaged. Graham died 30 years ago on the 19th of December 1993, aged 32. We had only been married for 6 years. I apologise that my health prevented me from speaking at second reading, as I was directly affected by the blood infection scandal, and I gave evidence to the inquiry. I hope your lordships will forgive this late intervention.
The noble Baroness Lady Brinton addresses a matter of profound importance to the thousands of us infected and affected by the shameful events that devastated the lives of so many. Your lordships will remember that in July 2017, Prime Minister Theresa May ordered a fully funded independent inquiry into how contaminated blood transfusions infected thousands of people with hepatitis C and HIV. She also allocated $75 million to be available for interim payments to victims still living and bereaved families. Yet, only 2 months ago, some 7 years on, the distinguished chair of the inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, expressed his frustration with delays in setting up a compensation scheme. He said, "The inquiry's final recommendations on compensation were published in April 2023. My principal recommendation remains that a compensation scheme should be set up with urgency." The government accepts the moral case for compensation, but these words are meaningless if action in the inquiry's recommendations is further delayed. It was in 1987 that Graham, then my fiancé, and his younger brother Anthony were first told they had HIV from factor VIII clotting agents. Anthony was first to die, leaving a widow and a 1-year-old daughter. Graham endured 5 years of misery, a barrage of associated illnesses, including pneumocystis pneumonia, epilepsy, and intermittent blindness. He died 18 months after his brother. It must have been unbearable for him to watch what he knew was in store for him, but his courage took my breath away. My lords, I count myself lucky. I eventually found a way to move on, enough to lead a good, purposeful life after Graham died. But the memory and the flashbacks don't fade. Thousands of other affected families haven't been as fortunate. The personal cost of the past ever present and haunting. Many wives of infected men lost their childbearing years. Parents and countless partners gave up jobs to care for loved ones at a time when HIV/AIDS was stigmatising and isolating. Over 3,000 deaths to date, and an average of one more every 4 days. The government has rightly accepted moral responsibility for its part in the tragedy, but it has procrastinated in establishing a compensation scheme. Not content with the guidance given by Sir Robert Francis, who was specifically appointed to make recommendations for compensation, the Cabinet Office has now appointed Sir Jonathan Montgomery to chair a group of experts to decide who gets what. Not surprisingly, the infected blood community are concerned, given Sir Jonathan's past links with 2 bodies implicated in the scandal, and they're unhappy about yet a further delay. According to the chair of the Haemophilia Society, it has caused huge anger and upset in the community. We certainly haven't been consulted, and neither have any other members of the community, as far as I'm aware. This is now the 3rd night to be asked for his opinion on it. First, Sir Robert Francis, then Sir Brian made his recommendations in his interim report. They're now asking for a 3rd time. It feels like they want to keep asking the same questions until they get an answer they like. I hope the Noble Lord, the Minister, will tell us how this latest body of experts on compensation will involve members of the infected blood community, whose lived experience makes them experts too. The need for such involvement is a consistent theme of Sir Robert's report if trust is to be restored. So, in the spirit of transparency, will he let his lordships have sight of the membership and the terms of reference of this new expert group? Can he also give an approximate timeline when compensation will be paid? As the government insists on waiting for the final inquiry report to be published on May the 20th, will he at least assure this House then that a compensation scheme will be ready to go live afterwards?
My lords, every year on the anniversary of my late husband's death, I visit St Botolph's Church in the City of London. It has a remembrance book with the names of hundreds of haemophiliacs who have died from infected blood products. Each year, I see new pages, new entries. Surely, this example alone should galvanise the government into compensating those still living as soon as humanly possible. Each delay means countless more deaths without the comfort of knowing that justice has been served for the infected victims and their affected partners and children.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
My Lords, I would like now to rise, if I may, to express my strongest possible support for all the amendments in this group, and I do congratulate Baroness Brinton and Baroness Campbell for their powerful speeches. As President of the Haemophilia Society for many years, I've met many of the victims infected in this appalling blood scandal, and many have died before any compensation was paid to them at all. Many others soldier on with the support of their families. My lords, we have all been moved by the post office scandal, but far too little, in my view, has been heard of the very different but certainly equally devastating suffering of the people given infected blood, many who were already suffering a serious condition. Their suffering was health-wise different, as we know, from the post office staff. The great thing about these amendments is that they provide clear deadlines and clear government responsibilities. Amendment 134 provides for the £100,000 interim compensation payment to be made to the nearest relatives of victims within 1 month of the passing of the Act, in line with Sir Brian Langstaff's report. No ifs, no buts. That is what these people need. They've waited and waited too long. And Amendment 133A ensures that the body to be established to administer the full and final compensation scheme will be established on behalf of government and will be fully funded by the Treasury. Let me tell you, my noble lords, all at the Haemophilia Society will be monitoring the progress of that body to make sure that it sticks to its brief. But my lords, we're talking about contaminated blood, which was imported from the US as early as the 1970s, often having been taken from prisoners with HIV and Hep C. This was not checked, and it was given to innocent sufferers, people already suffering with conditions, as I've already said. My lords, this was some 50 years ago, and yet we're still talking about compensation for the widows and children of these victims. I'm sure we're going to return to these issues at report stage, and I really implore the government, as well as the House, to support the tenor of these amendments.
Also to speak on in support of Amendment 134, and again I have to apologise for, I'm afraid, not having been able to attend the second reading debate. I wanted to speak on this amendment as someone who has spent a good deal of time in the last couple of years chairing one of the expert advisory groups for the Infected Blood Inquiry, looking at public health and administration. As a result of that, like some other members of this House, I spent a day at the inquiry giving evidence. And that day made a huge impression on me, as I know it will have done on others. And it made a huge impression because, not least because, there was an audience of dozens of victims who had suffered grievously for years and decades, and who I think have shown immense courage, determination and resilience in the face of what the Chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, has rightly said were serious failings over decades, which led to catastrophe and a loss of life, compounded suffering. As chairman of an expert advisory group, it wasn't for me to draw those wide conclusions. But I was able to see from the evidence and draw my own conclusions that during that period, there had been multiple breaches of the Nolan Principles and the conventions which preceded the Nolan Principles, and multiple breaches, I am sad to say, of the Civil Service Code. In other words, the state let these people down time and time again, and the state should now provide restitution without any further delay. There's one other reason why I am supporting this amendment, and it's because I feel not to do so would make me complicit in what now seems to be the way in which the state, in all its forms, now seems to respond to failings like this. We delay accepting responsibility as long as we can. We defend the indefensible. We place the reputation and the interests of institutions and the system above the interests of the people who have been harmed. We set up inquiries which inevitably delay action. And I am not in any way criticising the way in which Sir Brian has led the infected blood inquiry. I think it's been exemplary, and I think he's done a fantastic job. But we also then design unnecessarily complex systems for claiming compensation. And we don't do this once. We do all of that time and time again. It's happened with Windrush, it's happened with Grenfell, it's happened with the Post Office, and probably most heinously of all, it's happened with the infected blood inquiry. I think we've reached a stage where these responses themselves are a breach of the Nolan principles of public life, which, let me just remind the House, talk about integrity, accountability, openness and leadership. This amendment is seeking to change that. It's seeking to help rebuild trust, the public's trust in the way in which we govern. And it needs to be done quickly, because the inquiry report will come out in May. It will receive phenomenal attention. It will either further undermine the public's faith in government, or if we take this action now, perhaps people will believe that we are changing things through action and not through words.
Lords, 1975 is a long time ago, and I must say I am getting on in age now, and I wondered whether I would ever see the day that the decision I announced to the House of Commons with money attached, that we would go for self-sufficiency in blood products, would be honoured, at least in a way that some of the relatives who have lost many lives have been lost, some of the people would feel some sense of satisfaction. I could make a very long speech on all those people who have fought this fight with honour and dignity and integrity. And they belong to members of all political parties. It very soon became a cross-party campaign. I also want to make a few things clear. When we knew about this, actually it was earlier than 1975, a very remarkable book called The Gift Relationship by Professor Tippins, in fact identified the problem of these blood coming into our country from places where there were absolutely no safeguards at all on the very few questions you could ask about somebody's past health. We did at that time had no way of finding out whether blood was infected with hepatitis, for example. We had to ask a simple question as a method of trying to find out whether that blood donor was suitable. We would ask whether they'd ever been yellow, i.e., had they ever liver been affected so that they were jaundiced and as likely as not responded to have been affected by infective hepatitis. It was as crude as that. I also want to make it pretty clear to people that all through the years in which blood products were being used, that doctors knew well might be infected, they had an agonizing choice. They had to explain to the patients the risk. Sometimes, of course, there were children who were not able to really understand it. So you were putting the issue onto the parents. And of course, the parents had to juggle these very difficult and complex medical facts. And the pediatricians and hematologists had to do their best to explain to them what were the risks, without never really knowing. I can only say, when I first began to look at this question, I wondered or not we could get away with having a complete ban on blood products. It soon became very clear that if we did that, we would not be able to give blood products which might well not be contaminated to a very substantial number of patients. And here again, let's remember what the situation is. Eventually, we got a product that the parents could inject at home. That meant that if a child had fallen and was bound to bleed into either their knee or their arm or elsewhere, they could give the injection straight away, and very likely the child would not suffer any serious damage. But that was actually one of the worst products to give. And these choices were being made against this background of a lack of knowledge. But nothing explains the refusal of successive governments to pay compensation for those people who were affected. And nothing explains the delay, which meant that when AIDS came into, we still had no blood of our own, self-sufficient, and very likely not to be contaminated. Even then, we couldn't be absolutely sure that it would not be contaminated. So I would just say this, that what I would say, and I'll say very little more, would be much stronger, much more vehement, and much angrier if it was not for the circulation of the letter of Earl Howe to us about this debate. Now, I've known him in many different guises, and I know him to be a man of honor. And when I read this letter, I frankly don't need any more assurances that there will not be any unnecessary delays. I believe his words are very carefully chosen, and I think he understands, like many people from his own party and people who've been responsible for healthcare, that there can be no more ducking and weaving, no more appeals to from the Chancellor to delay it for another year or anything of this. This time we have to honour it, and we've got to do it this year. The report will be available on the 20th of May. Then everybody will be able to read, and judging by the day's evidence I gave, it will be a very searching and honourable report. But I think that we now know that using the device in the House of Commons of attaching it to this bill, which of course was a device, and now with the government responding to this device, not in a way of trying to dismiss it, but of making it more precise and effective, that particular battle, it seems to me, to be over. And we can be sure that by a matter of months in this year, payments will be made. I hope that can be made very clear from the front bench. Nobody comes out of this with a lot of distinction. But I would only say, let us read the report. And I suspect there will a lot of people who will feel very ashamed.
The House will listen with great interest to the remarks of my noble friend, Lord Owen, and the honourable part he played in this very tragic situation. I was a minister much later, Minister of Health much later, between 95 and 97. I had to struggle with, as Lord Owen said, problems of the Treasury and so forth, indeed getting reasonable compensation for the victims, the affected and the infected and the affected. And I'd like to thank Baroness Brinton for raising this issue today so we have had the debate of the kind we've had. It's very necessary, and we should keep pressing away as we have done. I was appalled, I have to say, by the statement before Christmas in the other place by John Glenn. It really was one of the emptiest statements I've heard, from a minister in that situation. It was as though the government was going through the motions of giving a statement because it had committed itself to do it without actually having anything at all to say, which is extremely disappointing. I was grateful to my noble friend Lord Howe for having much more sensible things to say, much more positive things to say in his letter so far, and we hope he can follow those up. But can I also comment on the remarks of Lord Bichard, who I think put his finger on something very important, not only in the tragedy, this particular case, but the way we are handling all these sort of problems. In particular, the length of time we're taking over these inquiries. This particular inquiry was actioned in 2017 and then started in 2018, so we've been going for over 6 years. We won a Second World War in less time than it's taken to complete this inquiry. We still haven't got to a final date, which we hope will be May of this year. The Swedes, for example, took 1 year to do a COVID inquiry. We will take God knows how many years to deal with COVID. How long are we taking with Grenfell? How long did we take with Chilcot? This is ridiculous, frankly, ridiculous we're taking so long with these things. I do think the government should pay attention to how we are handling these things, the length of time, the complexity, and all of that. And I do believe that, say, 2 years should be the maximum amount of time that we take to deal with these sort of issues. 2 years is long enough to come to some clear conclusions and have positive evidence. I do hope the government will take that aspect into account, as well as all the other important things which Baroness Brinton and Lord Owen raised.
My Lords, I apologise to the House that I wasn't available at second reading, and I wasn't intending to speak. I won't delay the House long, but I would like to add my plea to the government and my noble friend the Minister that this is indeed finally resolved. The speeches from the Noble Lady Baroness Brinton and the examples given from the Noble Lady Baroness Featherstone and the Noble Lady Baroness Campbell really should speak for themselves. And as a tribute to our noble friend, Lord Cormac, who has campaigned on this issue for so many years, it would seem to me fitting if my noble friend can give us really concrete reassurance from the front bench that finally this injustice will be properly remedied.
My Lords, this group of probing amendments, which have the aim of ensuring decent and necessary payments to all those bereaved in this disastrous scandal, have given the House the chance to consider the appalling plight of the victims of the infected blood scandal. My Lords, we welcome Clause 40, and in particular the words of 43A, that in exercising its functions, the administrative body must have regard to the need of applicants for speed of provision, simplicity of process, accessibility, involvement, proactive support, fairness and efficiency. My Lord, it's only to be hoped that the government lives up to the promise of that clause in future, because it has signally failed to do so in the past. My Lords, if this bill has taught us anything, it is that all victims of crime, of major incidents, of appalling and deeply shocking medical errors such as this one, as well as other administrative disasters such as the Post Office Horizon scandal, all the victims have so many needs that resemble each other. We need early admissions of responsibility and culpability. We need government and administrative bodies to face facts. We need to ensure that victims have early access to services and to the support they need, and that such services and support are in practice provided in full and in good time. My Lords, of course, one of the tragic aspects of this scandal is that the need for speed is particularly severe. It's worth reminding ourselves that since Sir Brian Lackerstaff's interim report of April 2023, more than 70 victims have died. The Noble Lord Bichard gave evidence to that inquiry, as did the Noble Lord Owen. Both spoke eloquently of its conduct. And it's worth remembering Lord Bichard's conclusion that the state let people down and should accept responsibility. He spoke of defending the indefensible, and Lord Horham, the noble Lord Horham, echoed his words. My lords, delaying compensation is denying responsibility. And as all noble lords who've spoken have said, there is no reason at all to wait any longer. Certainly not until the government have digested at length the contents of Sir Brian's final report. Any such delay would be a travesty of Sir Brian's principal call, which was for urgency. Sir Robert Francis's recommendations on the way the compensation should be handled, the report in June 2022, along with Sir Brian's report, now need urgent implementation. And it is to be hoped that the work of the experts panel established under the chairmanship of Jonathan Montgomery, who is the chair of Oxford University Hospitals NHS Trust, which was not a mile away from involvement in the crisis, that they do not delay or water down the recommendations of the two reports. And it's right to say that the campaigners are deeply concerned, as the noble Lady Baroness Campbell stressed. My noble friend Baroness Brinton, in opening this debate, and the noble Lord Owen, pointed out the strength and determination of this very long campaign. And we mourn the noble Lord Cormac, whose involvement in the campaign was also extensive and long-lasting. The noble Lord Owen spoke of the difficulties facing doctors and the lack of political will needed to ensure self-sufficiency in this country in blood products. We can only hope that the noble Lord's optimism in expecting the government now to react quickly and finally following the report due in May from Sir Brian Langstaff is justified. My noble friend Baroness Featherstone and the noble Lady Baroness Campbell added their accounts of personal tragedy and thereby movingly added to the demand for urgency. My lords, we know that the Horizon case has only led to definitive action with ITV's television drama. It should not be the same with the infected blood scandal. But we do understand that ITV has commissioned Peter Moffat to write such a drama. So perhaps public opinion will come to the rescue once again. My lord, the burden of my speech and the speech of all other noble lords who've spoken today is that should not, in a civilized and compassionate democracy, be necessary.
My lords, in arriving as we now have at part 3 of the bill, I should like to begin by thanking all noble lords who have spoken so powerfully and so movingly on a set of events which many regard as constituting the worst disaster in the history of the National Health Service. The story of those who received infected blood as part of their NHS care and treatment is a story of unimaginable suffering and terrible tragedy over more than 4 decades. It is a story that is still not yet over. And the suffering of victims has been made even worse by an absence of full justice for those individuals. And alongside that, a failure, I would suggest, to reach, as far as may be possible, a sense of closure. The official public inquiry currently underway under the chairmanship of Sir Brian Langstaff is the start of delivering the justice that is now needed. The inquiry has been informed by the expert work of Sir Robert Francis, and Sir Brian has so far published 2 interim reports on his findings, with his final report now due on the 20th of May this year. Meanwhile, in the other place, what is now Clause 40 was added to this bill with a view to speeding up the delivery process. My Lords, the government accepts the will of Parliament that arrangements should be put in place to ensure, as far as reasonably practicable, that the victims receive justice as quickly and efficiently as possible. Therefore, my desire, and I trust that of all noble lords, is to see the bill added to the statute book as soon as is reasonably practicable. The government is well aware that every passing season sees more suffering, more death, and more bereavement. We are therefore eager to avoid more needless delay. Ministers have already taken action and given a number of undertakings. The first is that we've promised that within 25 sitting days of Sir Brian Langstaff's final report being published, we will make a statement to Parliament setting out the government's response. Let me make clear that that period of 25 days is not a target, but a deadline. We will issue our response as soon as we possibly can. Meanwhile, in response to a recommendation from Sir Brian, we have made interim payments amounting to £440 million to infected individuals or bereaved partners registered with existing infected blood support schemes. Thirdly, in readiness for Sir Brian's final report, we've appointed Sir Jonathan Montgomery to chair an expert group whose remit is to advise the government on some of the legal and technical aspects of delivering compensation. My Lords, I do realise that some have questioned Sir Jonathan's appointment because of his former connection with Bayer. Noble Lords may wish to note that Sir Jonathan ceased to be a member of the Bayer Bioethics Council on the 31st of October last year, and that council was an independent advisory group which had no role in the day-to-day operations of the company. It has had no executive power on the operational business of Bayer. And let me just also emphasise another point. Nothing in the work of the expert group is intended to cut across the conclusions of the inquiry or the advice of Sir Robert Francis. Quite the opposite, actually. The expert group are there to enable ministers to understand certain technical issues and thus enable decisions to be taken more quickly. This takes us to the amendment passed by the House of Commons, which we're now considering. Noble Lords will understand that the provisions of any bill need to be legally coherent and shouldn't cut across the integrity of the statute book. There are 2 principal defects with Clause 40. The first is that its coverage does not extend to the whole of the United Kingdom. The government is clear that infected blood is a UK-wide issue. For that very reason, the infected blood inquiry was set up on a UK-wide basis. And indeed, in March 2021, we announced uplifts to achieve broad financial parity across the UK's infected blood support schemes, increasing annual payments to beneficiaries across the country as a whole. Maintaining a commitment to parity across the UK is extremely important. We also need to agree on a set of arrangements that are workable, and above all, arrangements that work for victims. And it is therefore essential for the UK government to engage with all the devolved administrations with those aims in view. That is what we are now doing. My honourable friend, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, met with counterparts from the Welsh government, the Scottish government, and the Northern Ireland Executive earlier this month to discuss this matter. And those discussions will continue. The second principal defect of Clause 40 is that in proposing the establishment of an arm's length body, as Sir Brian recommended, it doesn't also propose any specific functions for that body. The government's intention, therefore, is to bring forward an amendment at report stage which will correct these two deficiencies and add further standard provisions to ensure a more complete legal framework when setting up an ALB. And I plan to engage with noble lords in advance of report stage to discuss the content of the government amendment once it has been drafted. That drafting is not yet complete. One of the main reasons for this, which I personally felt strongly about, was that we should use this committee stage as an opportunity for a general debate on the infected blood scandal, and in advance of report for the government to be made aware of the views expressed by noble lords from around the chamber. And I hope the committee will agree that this was a reasonable approach. My remarks thus far have, I hope, given some reassurance to the noble Lord Ponsonby as regards amendments 133A and 133B. I listened carefully to the noble Lord's speech, and I entirely appreciate the concerns that he has raised. And I've already made clear that it is our aim to achieve parity of treatment across the entire UK. However, in the light of what I've said, I hope the noble Lord will understand why I can't at this stage say anything about the funding of compensation. In regard to the noble Lord's specific amendment 133B, it would not be appropriate for this bill to seek to override the existing processes that are in place to secure Her Majesty's Treasury funding. I cannot provide further reassurances at this stage, other than to say that the UK government has accepted the moral case for compensation. Let me now turn to Amendment 134, tabled by the noble Baroness Lady Brinton. I am grateful for this amendment, which seeks to probe, as she made clear, on how and when interim compensation payments will be made to affected victims of the infected blood scandal. Many noble lords will, I'm sure, share the noble Baroness's sense of urgency, expressed equally powerfully in the other place, on the need to deliver justice swiftly to the victims of the infected blood scandal. My lords, victims of infected blood have suffered terribly over many years, and that distress has been compounded by the financial uncertainty that they have faced. The government recognises the imperative of providing justice for these victims as soon as reasonably possible, and we are well aware that many have short-term needs. Interim compensation of £100,000 to those infected or their bereaved partners registered with the existing infected blood support schemes was paid in October 2022 for precisely that reason. I realise that the noble Baroness would like us to go further, faster. My lords, the need to move quickly and provide certainty is being taken very seriously. In advance of the government's formal response to the inquiry, which in turn depends on the publication of the final report, I regrettably can't commit to specifics as regards the cohorts of those individuals identified in the amendment, or provide answers to questions around eligibility generally. I wish it were otherwise. Nor can I yet overcome a legal impediment. The interim payments made from October 2022 have been made through the current infected blood support schemes, which are run separately in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. These schemes can only make payments to people registered with one of them. To extend interim payments to the cohorts identified in this amendment wouldn't be possible across the UK as a whole, because the legal powers to register and make payments to these new cohorts don't exist. Indeed, the alternative to registering individuals with existing schemes is making payments through a new arm's length body, as defined by clause 40. Now, my lords, I do hear the concerns around a delay and procrastination. Sir Brian has recommended the setting up of an arm's length body. Establishing an arm's length body is a significant undertaking for the government. There are processes which, unfortunately, cannot be expedited. This includes the appointment of staff, procurement of any required IT systems, ensuring that there is proper accountability to both the government and Parliament for expenditure of public funds. This does take a certain amount of time to achieve, with the best will in the world. And against that background, and my lords, I again say I wish matters were otherwise, I regret to say that I can't commit to a timetable or comment on the scope of any further interim payments at this time. However, I come back to what I emphasised earlier. The government's twin priorities are certainty and speed. With those aims in mind, I can assure the committee that the government amendment at report stage will have the desired effect of speeding up the implementation of our response to the inquiry's findings. And to provide further reassurance to the noble Baroness.
The noble Lord, he's mentioned that there will be government amendments at report stage to address the deficiencies that he's identified in clause 40. Does he envisage having the opportunity between now and report stage to prepare amendments to address some of the other legal impediments to widening the cohorts, for example, that he's identified? Because that of itself could accelerate clarification and speeding up the process.
I do anticipate using every opportunity available to engage with noble lords on not only what the amendments will comprise, but what we intend to do thereafter. And there is, of course, as noble lord will appreciate, a role for regulations in this space. I venture to say that quite a lot of the detail of the arrangements will be contained in regulations, which of course will be laid as soon as possible. To the extent that I can go into detail on what those regulations will contain, I should be happy to do so. But I'm not, I hope the noble lord will understand, in a position to do so today.
I apologise to interrupt the Minister, but you referred, Minister, to the payment of $100,000 to a lot of people in 2022, but is the Minister aware that, of course, the whole point of Amendment 134 is to fill all the gaps, all those people who did not receive an interim payment? And when the Minister referred to speeding up their response to the Langstaff inquiry, that's a verbal thing, as I understand it. The point is these people need urgent payment of $100,000. These people have not received any compensation, as I understand it, and it is absolutely urgent. We're talking 50-odd years ago, are we not? Here we are, and the idea that we still need more time, it just cannot be right. It cannot be right. So I hope the Minister can reassure us that absolutely everything will be done to get a payment of $100,000 out to these groups of people who have not yet received compensation immediately, within the month of the passing of the Act, as I think the amendment says.
My Lords, I do perfectly understand the noble Baroness's strength of feeling on this long-standing scandal. And it may be of some reassurance to her if I just repeat the words of my honourable friend, the Minister for the Cabinet Office in the other place, who said in December, "The victims of the infected blood scandal deserve justice and recognition. Their voice must be heard, and it is our duty to honour not only those still living and campaigning, but those who have passed without recognition." I met the Minister for the Cabinet Office to discuss these matters. My honourable friend assured me that this is indeed his highest priority. And I undertake to the committee that I will continue to work closely with him ahead of the next stage of this bill. My Lords, I am very grateful to noble Lords for their contributions to this debate and for highlighting so compellingly the issues that bear upon this appalling human tragedy. Ministers will reflect carefully on all that has been said. And I hope that my response has provided the noble Lord Ponsonby, and the noble Baroness Lady Brinton with enough in the way of reassurance, although I wish I could reassure even further about the government's intended course of action to enable, first of all, the noble Lord to withdraw his amendment, and for the other amendments in the group not to be moved when they're reached.
Sits down. I wonder if I could just ask him a couple of questions, and I'm very grateful to my noble friend Lord Marks, who asked exactly the question I wanted to know about what was going to happen between committee stage and report. Can I ask him, in other instances it has been quite speedy to set up a shadow body. After all, government now knows how to do it. Is there any capacity to start setting up a shadow body that would be ready to go? And my other question is, we don't yet know the timetabling of the report days, but clearly members of committee are going to need to see the government's amendments ahead enough of time to be able, particularly picking up the point raised by Lady Bichard just now, to try and address the deficiencies if those who are not currently included remain not included.
On the noble Baroness' latter point, I hope to be able to have extensive discussions with noble Lords about the government's amendments and their intended effect and their literal effect. On the question of setting up a shadow body, I asked this very question myself. There are two issues really here. One is I'm advised that it wouldn't in fact save any time. There are still a number of decisions to be made on the government response to infected blood. Clearly, we can't preempt those decisions by establishing an arm's length body without clarity on what its precise functions or role would be. Our intention, as I've said, is to bring forward amendments at report stage which will correct the defects in Clause 40 and have the desired effect of speeding up the implementation of the government's response to the inquiry. I will, however, take that point away to make sure that there really isn't any advantage in not having a shadow body. Government has done this before in other circumstances. It is worth thoroughly exploring as an option. I think I will be told that any idea of a shadow body would need to be considered alongside its interaction with the passage of the legislation and the government's response to the recommendations of the second interim report, and indeed the report as a whole. However, I hope the noble Baroness will be content to leave that question with me.
My Lords, I think this has been an important debate. In fact, I go further. I think it's been an historic debate, because in this relatively short debate, we've had two noble Lords, Baroness Featherstone and Baroness Campbell, who've spoken about very close relatives who've been affected by this tragedy. We've had two noble Lords, Lord Bichard and Lord Owen, who gave evidence to the inquiry. And I think Lord Owen, in his speech, went back the furthest, if I can put it like that, to 1975. And really, there are members who've spoken in this short debate who've really tracked this issue over the many decades that it has been lingering around. And I have to say, nobody is questioning the best intentions of the Noble Earl Lord Howe. He, as I know, has been involved in this issue in a number of different ways over many years as well. And I think my amendments are essentially probing amendments, and I do acknowledge the letter which the Noble Earl has sent to us. And obviously we won't be pressing the amendment, but I was going to ask the same questions as the Noble Lord Marks and Baroness Brinton about process. The government has said it'll put down amendments for report stage, and the Noble Lord the Minister has said that there will be opportunity for Lords to see the amendments essentially before that and to discuss it. But of course, we may want to put down amendments to his amendment, and we would want to make sure that we have ample time to do that. But I know the Noble Lord understands that point, but I just repeat it from these benches as well. My Lords, there's really been a very comprehensive discussion of the issues, and I think that all Noble Lords, their essential point is to want to reach a conclusion, start distributing funds as soon as practicable, and it's really for a sense of decency that the government, aided by all opposition parties, to help the government actually achieve this. It really is a tragedy. Well, as a number of Noble Lords have said, it's the worst scandal in NHS history, and it really is incumbent on all of us and all sides of this House to make sure that the matter is concluded as quickly as possible. But I beg leave to withdraw Amendment 133A.
Is it your Lordship's pleasure the amendment be withdrawn? The amendment is by leave withdrawn. Amendment 133B, Lord Ponsonby, not moved. The question is that Clause 40 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it. After Clause 40, Amendment 134, the Baroness Brinton, not moved. Not moved.